In this video, we're going to look at exposure blending, and we're going to learn the basics of exposure blending and try and take our understanding of luminosity masks a little bit further. Now, as I already mentioned earlier and on the sales page for this course, this isn't for beginners to Photoshop. If you're a brand new user to Photoshop, you need to have some experience using it, understanding the logic behind the software, and also you really need to understand what masking is. If you don't know what masking is, you're going to find this very difficult. So please Google what is masking and understand how important it is to brush in with black or white brushes and how that affects the masks and the layers that the masks are attached to. You don't need to be an absolute expert on masking just to understand what masking is and how you use it in your workflow. If you've got that understanding, then we can take this further. Now, this isn't an exhaustive course on luminosity masks. I've already covered that in my Art of Digital Blending course and in the Mastering Raya Pro course. Nevertheless, we are going to go into detail about how we can use exposure blending in our workflow, and obviously you're going to see me demonstrate that throughout the course. But right now, I'm going to show you how we can use apply image and luminosity masks in our workflow, and also we're going to play with some of the actions that we installed earlier on. So let's get straight to the tutorial. Here we have an image with three exposures. We have a dark exposure, a really dark exposure on top, and right at the bottom we have the base exposure. Now I always put the base exposure at the bottom. This makes up most of the information in our image. Now in this example, I'm only going to work with two exposures, the middle exposure and the base exposure. And my goal is to get the sky from the darker exposure and blend it with the foreground to some degree with this base exposure. Now, if I just grab the magic wand tool and I draw over the sky, make a selection of the sky there, and I create a mask by pressing the Add a Mask button at the bottom here, you'll see that we've created a mask, a black and white mask. And whatever's white in our mask will be selected, and whatever's dark in our mask is not selected. And by the way, if you ever want to make a mask visible, so you want to view the mask, we hold down Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC, and we left click on the mask. And then when we're finished, we just need to click on the layer and it goes back to the normal view. Now, since in our mask the sky is white, that means the sky from the darker exposure is visible. And because the foreground is dark, that means the foreground is invisible from the darker exposure. We're using the foreground from the brighter exposure. Now, if I just zoom in to the horizon here or to the buildings, we can see that it's a really poor transition between exposures. It looks really unnatural. You can see it's kind of jagged. It's just too contrasting or too extreme. The great thing about luminosity masks, I'm just going to delete this mask. The great thing about luminosity masks is we can build a mask based purely on brightness. And that means we get a feathered blending effect. And what I mean by that is when we blend these exposures, we don't get the jagged edge that you've just seen in the last example. Instead, we should get a smooth transition between the brighter and darker exposure. Now don't worry if you're not exactly sure what that means. I'm going to show you soon. And I'm going to show you a very quick example using apply image just to show you how I can blend these exposures. You don't have to follow along with this. I'll take you through the steps later. This is just to show you what I mean by creating a feathered natural mask. So I'm going to keep this darker layer invisible. I'm going to create a mask by clicking on the Add a Mask icon. Then I'm going to go to Image, Apply Image, and keep the settings the same and just press OK. Now you'll see we've created a mask on this layer, and I'm going to make the layer visible, and all of a sudden we've blended our exposures relatively naturally. So if I just zoom into this horizon, you can see we don't have the jagged edges like we had before. Now the reason why is, if we look at this mask again, last time in the previous example we had a completely white sky and a totally black foreground. But now we're actually faced with an image which is more or less a grayscale version of our base exposure. So what we have now is a sky which is quite bright for the most part, and a foreground which is relatively dark, but it isn't a highly contrasting mask. So when we blend in these two exposures, we're doing it much more subtly and much more gently. Now when it comes to masking, whatever is white will be completely visible, whatever's light grey will be partially visible, whatever's dark grey will be less visible, and the darker the shade of grey going all the way to black, the less visible that area will be on the layer. So because we have, say for example, this layer down the bottom right hand corner, this part of the exposure, slightly darker, less of this area is going to come through from the darker exposure. So it will be slightly visible because as you see, it's not completely black. But watch what happens when we zoom into this area and we show the before and after. You see, it's not making a massive difference to the base exposure. This is what the base exposure looks like, and this is what the darker exposure looks like after it's been blended with the mask on. However, since the sky is brighter in the mask, as you can see here, then much more of the sky is actually coming through on the final blend. Now watch what happens if I make this foreground completely black. I'm going to choose a black paintbrush, set my foreground to black, and I'm just going to paint with the mask selected in this area. So now it's completely black. So now you can see it black in the mask. When I zoom in and we look at the base exposure, this is what the base exposure looks like with the dark exposure invisible. And now when I make the darker exposure visible, you'll see it's not making any difference to that area. So whatever's black in the mask won't come through from the darker exposure. And whatever's really dark grey will have a little bit of impact. So essentially, when we create masks, we need to ask ourselves, what do we want to select in the image? So if we want to select the sky in an image, we need the sky to be white or really light grey. And if we don't want to affect the foreground, we need that to be dark grey or black. So that's our goal in exposure blending and creating masks. Now with that in mind, let me show you a standard way to blend exposures. Here we have a forest scene. We have a base exposure, which has some overexposed areas you see in the sky here, and also some underexposed areas in these trees. Now I've captured a darker exposure, so we have a little bit more information in these areas. And I've captured a brighter exposure, so we have much more information in the darker area. Now, when I blend exposures, I always put the base exposure on the bottom. If I'm blending 3 exposures, I always put the darkest exposure in the middle and then the brightest exposure on top. Now you can be creative with that. This is just the way I like to do it. So it's entirely up to you if that's the way you want to do it. Now we want to create a mask that's going to bring in the brightest areas of this darker exposure and blend them with the base exposure. But there's something very important to remember. And I'm going to take us back to this first example to show you what I mean. Whichever exposure we have visible on this big screen, that's what we're going to build the mask around. So for example, let's say we want to select the sky, we want it nice and bright. I'm going to create the mask just as before, then I'm going to go to Image, Apply Image, and you can see we have the mask here. And now when I press OK, I'm going to make the mask visible. And the mask that we now see is the exact same version, a black and white version of our base exposure. It's identical to it. And because the base exposure has a bright sky, that means we can create a bright sky in our mask because we've built the mask around this base exposure. Like I said, whatever's on this big screen right in front of us, that's what the mask's going to be built around. So that's why it's built around the base exposure. Now watch what happens if I delete the mask and I make this dark exposure visible. I'm going to create a new mask, go to Image, Apply Image, and press OK. Now look at the mask. It's a really dark mask, especially in the sky. And since that's dark, that means we're not going to bring through much of the sky from this darker exposure. And that's obvious through the final blend. Clearly now the two images haven't blended well. That's before and that's after. And like I said before, that's because our mask now has a dark sky. The sky isn't selected in the mask. And this mask is now a perfect black and white version of the darker exposure. So the question we need to ask ourselves when we're about to blend exposures is, which exposure is going to give me the best selection? And in this example, it's the base exposure. And usually when we're blending a darker exposure into a base exposure, the vast majority of times we need to make the darker exposure invisible and then create our masks. Now, if you think it's going to be hard to remember that, I've actually created an automated feature which does all of this for you in the actions that you've already installed, and we'll look at that later on. But just remember, in order to blend a darker exposure into a base exposure, we make the darker exposure invisible, and then we press Image, Apply Image, and press OK. And you'll see we've had a much better final result. So let's go back at the example I was showing you before. Here we have the forest, and again we have the base exposure and a darker exposure which is going to expose for the sky, and we have a brighter exposure for the shadows in the trees. Now, in order to blend these, again, like I said before, the darker exposure must be invisible. And I create the mask on the darker exposure, and I press Image, Apply Image, and just press OK. And there you go, we've darkened a lot of those areas that were overexposed. So this is before and that's after. And please excuse the chromatic aberration. These raw files haven't been cleaned in Adobe Camera Raw yet. So now we've blended that. In order to blend the bright exposure into the rest of the image, we have to make the bright exposure visible. So this isn't like the dark exposure where we made the dark exposure invisible. Here, we're going to build a mask around the bright exposure because the bright exposure has lots of information in these shadows, and it's going to give us a pretty good selection. Now I'm going to show you different examples of that throughout the course so you get a good idea of what I'm talking about. But always remember this, when blending a dark exposure into a base exposure, I'm sorry to repeat myself, keep the dark exposure invisible. But when blending the bright exposure into the rest of the other exposures, keep the bright exposure visible. Again, the actions that I've supplied here will do all of this for you, so you don't need to think about it. But just in case you want to do it yourself, please remember those rules. Now, with the bright exposure visible, I create a mask. I go to Image, Apply Image, and this time, instead of having the settings as it is, I press Invert. And you'll see we've created an inverted mask, and now we've brought a load of information into these trees. So let's look at the bright mask here. Now, all of the trees in our mask are white, and that's because we wanted to select the trees. They're the darkest part of the image. And we want to bring through the information from the trees from this brighter exposure and blend them with the other two exposures. So that's why we wanted the trees to be white. But the mask on the darker exposure is an inverted version, an exactly inverted version of our bright exposure. So this is only selecting the highlights, the brightest parts of the image. Now in both of these examples, I think the effect has been a little bit strong. So with the brighter exposure, we can bring down the opacity quite a lot, just so it looks a bit more natural. That's before and after. You see, we're still bringing back that great detail in the trees that wasn't there before, but it doesn't look too strong. And with our darker exposure, we can bring that down just a little bit. It actually looks okay so far. So this is the before and after. This is the image before. We had overexposed areas in the highlights, and obviously we had underexposed areas in the trees. And this is the final result. So if we just zoom into this area, here's the before and after. Before and after. So we've seamlessly blended those exposures. Now let's take this a step further. I'm going to make the brighter exposure invisible. And we're going to look at the mask again. Now, as you can see, the mask is a decent mask. It's making some very good selections of the brighter parts of the image, but it's also affecting a lot of the parts of the image that we don't necessarily want to affect, like this tree here. So if I make it full 100% opacity, it actually flattens much of the image. It's not just affecting the sky, it's affecting a lot of the image, like this tree here. So instead, we can make a more targeted mask. Remember, whatever's bright in the mask is selected and whatever's dark is less selected. So we can make a more contrasting mask. In other words, we can make the highlights more selected, but we can make the midtones of the shadows darker, so they're less selected. And we do that by selecting the mask and pressing Command and L or Control and L. And here we can bring down our level slider, and you see we're making more contrast in the mask so that we're affecting only a more targeted part of the image. So right now we're only targeting the highlights and some parts of the tree, and this tree to the right. So if we press OK, this is the final outcome. Now we're affecting a lot less of the image. So let's take this to an even more extreme example. So again, I'm going to hold down Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC and click on the mask. I'm going to press Command and L or Control and L to bring up the levels dialog. And I'll bring that all the way along and press OK. And now we're really only affecting the sky. Look at the way the sky is affected and not the tree. Now this is before we made the change. And this is after. So it's a much more targeted change just to the highlighted parts of the image. And we can do the same with the brighter exposure. Now we don't have to do it in this example, but I will show you more examples later on. So essentially we can create masks through Apply Image, and then we can refine those masks through a levels dialog. Now again, if all of this seems to be a lot to think about, don't worry, because these actions will do everything for you. And if you're an Instamask user, for example, you don't need to use the actions at all, or a Raya Pro user. For example, with Instamask, you can just press something like a Darks 1 if you want to blend in the brighter exposure. And then if you're happy, you can just press Apply. And now we can bring down the opacity so it's much more natural. There's before and after. And now, if we want to blend in the darker exposure, we can again make the darker exposure invisible. And let's go for a Brights 1. And just as before when we use the levels dialog to change the mask and refine it, well, we can do that with these sliders here. So we're just targeting really the highlights. And if we're happy, we can make the darker exposure visible, select the darker exposure and press Apply. And just like that, we've blended those three exposures beautifully. So as you can see, using Instamask and Raya Pro is a little bit easier than using the actions or doing it yourself. Now let's move on to the actions that are included in the course. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different actions. Now let's say I want to blend in the darker exposure. Well, I have to make the brighter exposure invisible here. We're just affecting the darker exposure. Now, if I want full control over the blending process, so I don't want the actions to do anything for me, I just want to run Apply Image. Well, if we go to Dark Exposure, Apply Image, and we make the image invisible because it's the darker exposure and press play, you'll see we've now applied the masks. So that's a very quick way just to do a basic apply image. Now, if you want to do that, but you don't want to have to remember that you have to make the mask invisible, well, instead this time you can go to Auto Dark Exposure Apply Image. So a quick way to remember this, just look for the word auto to know which action is going to do stuff automatically for you. So you'll notice that the darker exposure is visible here. I'm not making it invisible, it's completely visible. And I just press play. And now not only has it created the mask for us on the darker exposure, it's also given us this levels dialog so that we can play around with it and then press OK. And when that's finished, it creates a layer called dark. And there you go. Now for the brighter exposure, I'm going to make it visible. And just as before, if you press Bright Exposure Apply Image, that will just give you the applied mask directly to your layer so you don't have to do it. But if you want everything to be done automatically for you, just choose Auto Bright Exposure Apply Image. And again, this will create the mask and also the levels dialog. And we can press OK. So now we've very simply blended those two exposures, and we're going to use these actions throughout the course. Now what we're actually doing here is working directly with luminosity masks. Some people think that Apply Image and luminosity masks are two different things, but that's actually not the case. A luminosity mask is just a mask based on brightness, as we've already seen. The reason why some people think luminosity masks and Apply Image are different is because with luminosity masks traditionally we make active selections. So we make a selection and then we paint in the change. But with apply image, as you've just seen, we make a mask and we build a mask directly on the layer. So it's very quick and very easy, and there's no painting involved, no masking. But what if we do want to paint in the selection instead of applying it directly to a mask? So we only want to affect certain areas. Well, let me show you this example here. We have a bathroom here. We have a darker exposure, which exposes nicely for the window. And we have a base exposure, which is brighter. And we want to keep most of the base exposure. We just want to bring the window back from the darker exposure. But let's say I use the auto dark exposure apply image. And let's make the mask a little bit more contrasting and press OK. Here it's done a really good job, but it's affecting other parts of the image. So it's affecting the wall to the right here. And it's affecting the shower to the left. And basically flattening the image a little bit. So we just want to make a targeted change. We don't want to make that selection and apply it directly to a mask. So how do we do that? Well, one way to do that is to create an adjustment layer, let's say a curves layer, and we can go to image, apply image, and make sure your settings are the same as mine, and just press OK. Now we've created a mask on the curves layer. To make sure this mask only applies to the window, we can choose the dark layer, and I'm going to create a mask on the dark layer, but I'm going to hold down Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC and click the mask icon, and you'll see we create a black mask. And I'm going to make this exposure visible now. Now with the curves layer that we created, to make this into an active selection, we hold down Command on a Mac or Control on a PC, and we left click. You see we have a little square that appears on the hand, and we left click right on the thumbnail, and now we've made the active selection. To hide the marching ants, we press Command and H or Control and H. Now you have to make sure that the Command H shortcut is set up on your computer for that to work. Now I select the mask, I choose a paintbrush, and because we want to make the window visible from the darker exposure, this means we want a white foreground. We want the window area to be white in the mask. Now I'm going to make the brush a little bit smaller, and I'm just painting in the window. And you see we're only affecting this window area. And we can bring down the opacity if we feel it's a little bit too dark. And there's the before and after. So that's how we can use an active selection and just paint in a certain area in our image. Now, press Command and D or Control and D to deselect that selection. And I'm going to show you how to do that with Instamask. So open up Instamask. And of course, we make the darker exposure invisible. Now let's say I'm going to choose a brights one. And I want to create a slightly more contrasting mask. So I just want to affect the window. Then I can press Select. And you'll see we have an active selection. I press Command and H or Control and H to hide the ants. Now with the darker exposure selected, I press Black M, Black Mask. So we create a black mask on that layer. We've got white foreground set. And now just as before, I'm painting in the window. And that's how easily we can use Luminosity Mask to blend exposures. And if you're a Raya Pro user and you want to learn how to do this, we can delete that mask, press Command and D again or Control and D to deselect any active selection. I'm going to open up Raya Pro, go to Luminosity Masks. I'm going to make the darker exposure invisible. Then I'm going to create a black mask on my darker exposure, just as we did before, by holding Option or Alt on a PC and left clicking on the Add a Mask icon. Then I'm going to create a bright set of luminosity masks, choose brights one, and I can manually adjust the luminosity mask just to make it more contrasting. Press OK, and now I can make my darker exposure visible, hide the marching ants, select the mask, and paint in that area. And that's it. Now, as you can see, using Instamask is a lot better than using the traditional luminosity masks in Raya Pro. But if you're a CS6 user, currently Instamask doesn't work for CS6. But nevertheless, the luminosity mask functions in Raya Pro are still very good. Now I'm just going to delete all the bright channels that I created, and I'm going to delete this mask. So as you can see, painting in luminosity masks is a really effective way of blending exposures. And now let's look at the actions that I've created. So even if you don't have Raya Pro or Instamask, there is a quicker way to use luminosity masks instead of doing it manually yourself. Just like before, I've created an automatic action which will do everything for you. And with a darker exposure, you don't actually have to make it invisible in this example because the action will do it itself. So with the dark layer selected, choose Dark Exposure Luminosity Mask and press play. And just as before, we get the mask and the levels dialog. When we've made it nice and contrasting and we've selected the window mainly, we can press OK. Now you'll notice we have a black mask on the darker exposure, obviously because that's invisible, and we need to paint in the window from that exposure. And to make the selection, we've got a layer here called Temp Mask. And this is just temporarily housing the mask that we created. So we hold down Command on a Mac or Control on PC and left click on that thumbnail to create the selection. And we press Command and H or Control and H. We make sure we've got the black mask selected of the dark layer, our foreground set to white, and just as before, we paint in this window. And when we're finished, we press Command and D or Control and D to deselect that selection. And that's it. So this action makes it very, very simple for you. And you can choose to delete this layer or keep it in case you want to use that selection later on. I'm going to delete it right now and just show you something else. So far, I've only showed you how to apply luminosity masks or apply a selection, an active selection, to a dark exposure. But what if we want to do it the other way around? So we've got a brighter exposure and we want to put this into the darker exposure. So basically, we want to paint in all of the darker areas into this darker exposure, but we want to keep the window from the darker exposure. So what does this mean in terms of a mask? Well, we have to make the brighter exposure visible. So the brighter exposure is always visible when we're creating a mask which targets the shadows. So essentially, we want a mask which is going to make most of this image white or light gray, but the window and some other highlights black or really dark gray. So let's look at this luminosity mask. We have something called Bright Exposure Luminosity Mask in the actions that you've got. So if we just press play, now we have the same inverted mask that we had before when we were blending the window into the base exposure. And to make this a more inclusive selection, in other words, to target more of the shadows, I can bring down the midtones and look at how we're brightening up most of the image. So that means whatever's white here will be white in the mask of the brighter exposure. So that will be visible from the brighter exposure. Now naturally we want this window to be dark because we don't want the window from the brighter exposure. So I'm going to bring the shadows along and making that nice and dark. And when that's done and I'm happy, I'm going to press OK. And again, just as before, we have something called Temp Mask. But this time you have to create the mask manually on the bright exposure. So we need a dark mask. Again, we're going to hold down Option or Alt and left click on the mask. And now to make that selection, again, we're going to press Command or Control and left click on the mask. And Command and H or Control and H to hide the marching ants. Now I'm going to choose a big brush, a white paintbrush again, because we're painting on a black mask. We want to bring this layer through. And watch what happens when we paint in this layer. You see, we've brought through the brighter exposure, but we haven't affected the window. Now, the great thing about luminosity masks is that we can actually run our brush over the same area a few times to maximize the effect. So watch what happens. You see, we're bringing more of the base exposure through. We're brightening up our scene. And I'm going to do it again, one more time, just to brighten it up. Now, there's something really important to remember when exposure blending, and it involves your brush. When you're using exposure blending, you must have your flow at 100%. This makes sure that the painting you do on your mask is consistent in all of the areas, so it doesn't become patchy. So make sure your flow is set to 100%. So now I want to go full circle and return to this image that we went to before. Now, if you remember, we used Apply Image and we applied a mask to the darker exposure to bring through the sky into the base exposure. Now what you might notice is that the mask has quite a lot of grey areas here in the sky. So that means only some of the sky from the darker exposure is blending in to the brighter exposure. Let me show you what I mean. If I disable this mask, look at the sky in the darker exposure. See, we have a lot more detail. It's a much more beautiful and attractive sky than the final result makes us think. And that's because we applied the mask straight to the layer. But if we use this selection and paint over it multiple times, just like we've seen before, we can actually strengthen the mask and make more of that sky come through. So let me show you exactly what I mean. Now, if you're an Instamask user, all you need to do is choose Brights 1, bring down the highlights. You see we're making a more contrasting mask. We don't want it to be too contrasting. A mask like this is never going to give us a smooth blend. We needed to make it just a little bit more contrasting, not too sharp. So let's say if we go for something like this. So we still have some grey areas in the sky. Now if I press select and black mask, so I create a black mask on the darker exposure, and press Command and H or Control and H to hide the marching ants. Now when I paint through the sky, let me just make sure we've done this nice and consistently. If we look at the sky to the left here, it looks kind of grey. It doesn't look very impressive. But watch what happens if I paint through again. Now we've brought through much more of that sky. Now I'm trying to avoid the mountains here, just in case that gets a little bit too dark. And now I go through the sky here again, and each time we're bringing through that beautiful detail from the clouds in the darker exposure. So that is the before and after. It's a massive difference to the first example. And obviously if it's a little bit too dark, we can reduce the opacity of that layer just a little bit. So to do that with the actions that I've supplied you, we can delete that mask, make this layer opacity at 100% and make it invisible again. And now we can go to Dark Exposure Luminosity Mask, press play, and we're going to make a more contrasting mask, just as we did before, but we don't want it to be too contrasting, and press OK. And now we press Command or Control and click on the mask of the temporary layer, select the black mask of the darker exposure, make it visible, hide the marching ants, and we're just going to paint through that mask again. And it's usually this left hand side which needs to be done a little bit more. So I'm going to do that again. And we're strengthening that mask even more, bringing through those fantastic clouds. So that's the before and after. Now I should mention I rarely use more than 3 exposures in exposure blending. Most of the time we just don't have to. This isn't like HDR software where we need a huge range of brackets one stop apart. I know of course we shot that same typical way of shooting brackets, but usually we only need 3 exposures in even the most extreme examples. Now this isn't an extreme example, but I want to show you how I would blend 3 exposures here. And you're going to see more examples as the course goes on of this. But I now want to use this much darker exposure and bring back some of the information in this area here, which you see is overexposed. Now to do that first, I'm going to have to press Command and D or Control and D to deselect that active selection. And just as I said before, the dark exposure that we're working on always has to be invisible when we're creating masks. Now we want to target this area. If we made this exposure invisible and we created a mask, well, we already know what's going to happen. It's going to create a mask of the entire sky. So like I said before, we have to ask ourselves, what image is going to give us the best selection of the area we want to select? We only want to select this area and maybe some of the light blue areas around. So having this darker exposure visible is giving us that selection. So we always want to make the darker exposure that we're working on invisible. But often it's okay to keep the darker exposures that you've already blended visible. So to blend that, I'm going to use Instamask and I'm going to choose, let's say, a Brights 2, which gives us a more targeted selection, as you can see. And I'm going to bring over the highlights just to make it more targeted, and I'm going to press select. Now I'm going to create a black mask, hide the marching ants, make sure this layer is visible, and I'm going to paint in that area. Just make my brush a little bit smaller. And look at how we're beautifully restoring those brighter areas. So here's the before and after. And it's such a smooth, natural transition. Now it is a little bit dark, so I should reduce the opacity of that layer a little bit. And there we go, that looks much better. So how do we do that with your action? Well, just as we did before. I'm going to deselect the active selection. I'm going to go to my actions and choose dark exposure luminosity mask. And we don't have to make sure this dark exposure is invisible because the action will do it for us. Press play. And now we just need to make a more targeted mask, targeting only this area here. I think that's a pretty good selection. We press OK. And now I press Command or Control on a PC and left click on this mask. Hide the marching ants. We've already got the paintbrush selected, and we just paint in those areas. And we can even paint in these areas here. Actually, that's a little bit too strong, so I can reduce the opacity of the brush here to 30% and just paint it in a bit more gently. And that's the before and after. And if you want, when you're finished, you can delete these temporary masks. And we press Command and D to deselect whatever active selection we have. And that is the before and after. Before we had overexposed areas in the sky and around the sun, and we brought back most of the sky with the dark exposure. And with the darkest exposure, we brought back the most overexposed parts of the sky. And that's it for your crash course for exposure blending. The actions are going to speed up the whole process throughout the course for you. And if you're an Instamask or Raya Pro user, it's all automated and easy to use. Now, as the course progresses, we're going to see more examples of how to blend exposures, bright exposures and dark exposures. And we're going to look at different scenarios in different ways to prepare our raw files so that exposure blending is much more natural and easy.